oil markets are said to be 90% politics and 10% everything else. But here I have with me a man who understands just about everything that is to know about the crude markets and is often considered to be the last word on everything with respect to the energy markets worldwide. I have with me Dr. Fereidun Fesharaki, the chairman of Facts Global Energy. Dr. Fesharaki, it's a pleasure having you with us. Very first television interview as well, right here with an Indian television channel. I want to pose 5 questions to you, and I'm going to surround my our discussions around those 5 questions. Firstly, and I think everyone wants to know this, what's the broad range of oil that one can expect? Secondly, is America the kingmaker? Thirdly, why has Iran exports not dwindled down to zero? Fourthly, what's going to be the impact of electric vehicles and clean energy? And finally, how does India really come into the entire equation of global oil? So I'm going to first start off my question on America. I mean, I suppose a couple of years ago, when we talked about oil, I would have started off this interview by talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran and Middle East and OPEC. But I think this time around, I guess people wouldn't blame me for starting off the discussion with America. It's slowly and steadily risen to become one of the largest oil producers in the world. How would you say, and how would you essentially describe the journey? I mean, I understand that a couple of years ago, America actually did not allow exports of oil, and now here we are in this situation.
Yes, indeed. Until 2016, exports were banned. Yeah. And today, U.S. exports about 2.5 million barrels per day. So U.S. production is going up, but let us remember, still U.S. is a net importer. Maybe net importer position will change and become a net exporter, but minor exporter. The reason the Saudis are so powerful is that most of the oil they export. Their own domestic consumption is very small. But the U.S., the domestic consumption is so huge. 40% of gasoline demand in the world is in U.S. alone. So the U.S., the additional volume that they can export is limited. The second thing is that the U.S. oil industry is run by the private sector. Everybody maximizes the production. They don't have any hidden capacity that they can come up and overwhelm the world. But the Saudis actually cut back production. So they have capacity left over that when there's a crisis like Venezuela, they can unleash it in the market. The Americans cannot replace anybody because they're always producing at maximum volume because of the short-term requirements of the private sector.
Do you think that the OPEC and the non-OPEC members, the coalition, actually underestimated America and the entire shale revolution back in 2010 and 2011 when crude prices were at $80 and $90 per barrel? Do you think that the shale revolution was really underestimated by them?
By everybody, including the US government. The US Geological Survey, which is the most important body in the US about geology of the US, they forecast the US shale oil production can never go above 4. This is now producing 8. So it is not that they were mistaken, the whole world was mistaken. The question is, how much is the limit? How far can they go? We are pretty convinced that they can go up another 2-3 million barrels per day, but it does come to an end. That it is not an open-ended volume. Maybe 10-11 million barrels per day would be the limit, today the 8.5. Yeah. By 22-23, they would hit a plateau. And the decline rates would be so fast, they have to pump money in to keep it the same level. So they're not going out of business, but the growth is not indefinite.
Okay, so you are not that, how would I say it, bearish. I would say you are a bit bearish when it comes to shale. Would it be right? I mean, you don't think it's enough to tilt scales for the global oil supply source?
No, I think that we have to remember that the Americans, they don't have any hidden volume. The power in the oil market is that oil that you can produce, but you're not producing. That whenever you want, you increase production, then you pull it back. When you have a small-scale private sector in America, and again, remember, this is not the ExxonMobil and Shell and BPs or big producers, it's all the small players. These guys maximize everything at the moment, at the right moment, and there is no holding back. So the power to influence the market is much more limited than the power of the Saudis, who can order, the king can order, go up to this volume, come back to this volume. The Saudis today have more than 1 million barrels per day or a little bit more extra capacity. So Venezuela goes down, I replace it. But the Americans cannot replace Venezuela because they're already doing maximum. So it's not the total production which matters, it's the ability to swing up and swing down.
Okay, that's an interesting point. At what level do you think shale would tend to become unprofitable. Like you mentioned, the Saudis did think that, okay, at 80, let's wait, and then 70, 60, 50, 40, still, they kept pumping out oil. So don't you think at some point it would perhaps become unprofitable for these makers?
The U.S. has three major basins. The biggest basin is called Permian Basin. Okay. Permian Basin is economic at 45 to 50.
Okay.
But the other two basins, which is called which are the two additional areas, those additional volumes would take $55 to $60. Okay. If the prices are below 55, they are marginal. They don't make any money. Okay. Average 52, 53. Okay. But a specific one, Permian, 45, 50. So costs have come down a lot. But I don't think the cost can go down much more. At the moment, the service companies are all giving them almost no margins for themselves. And it's a very tough environment to make a lot more money. But the prices can go down to 50, 52 on average. The Americans are in business. You go down to 40, big problem.
Okay. I was reading your memo for 2019, and you've ended the memo in saying Trump's tweets must stop. What ability does Donald Trump, or rather, do you think he has affirmed his position as kingmaker in the oil markets with the series of events that we have seen in the last couple of months? And to what extent do you think, is he powerful enough to be able to control the events, whether in the Middle East, whether in Vienna, as we saw in the recent OPEC meeting?
Well, at the last OPEC meeting, he sent a special representative to go and tell the Saudis, I don't want the price to go up. His power comes from his influence on the Saudis. And today, with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia being under so much international pressure, his best friend is Donald Trump. So Donald Trump said jokingly, I called the king and I told him, hey king, how are you? And he said, I'm fine. He said, I wanted to let you know you can't last 2 weeks without me. That may be an exaggeration, 2 weeks, but basically the dependence on the US is very high. So if a president comes strongly and said, you must do this, then they will try to comply. So he is very important because of the influence he has on the Saudis.
Well, he still went ahead and did cut the output. I mean, 1.2 million barrels per day. I mean, they were forced to mop up the inventory.
Right, but the price, he doesn't want the prices to go much above 65, 70, and I think he's gotten what he wanted.
Okay, all right. 1.2 million barrels. Now, you made a very interesting comment on compliance. In the past, I think in December 2016 or Jan 2017, when the first time around this whole output cut topic was brought about, I think the compliance over there was decent. Now is when we are seeing some resistance come in, more particularly from Russia, where the compliance has been very low as opposed to what was decided in Vienna. I think the last time I had a Reuters report which says 86% compliance. Do you see that sort of an attitude come in among the coalition members where they do not necessarily feel the need to go for 100% compliance?
Well, the kingpins are the Saudis and the Russians, but actually, even the last time around, the Russian contribution was only 200,000 barrels per day. So the Russians know for sure that the Saudis would do the job if they don't. That instead of them cutting, the Saudis would cut. So it's a game of chicken. You push them at the edges, and you see if there is really a drop in the price of oil to $40. Last time, the Russians came in a big way. But at the moment, $60, $62 is what Mr. Putin prefers. It seems okay. They don't have the pressure to do it. And they do know that the Saudis will shoulder the burden when they have to.
So you mentioned 5-year OECD inventory averages, a benchmark that the coalition does look at when deciding on output. How far away are we from that average at this point?
As I mentioned, if you fully comply, 90 days. Okay. If you partially comply, if January is the model, 5 months. But in any way you look at it, before June, you're already at that level or lower.
So in April, when the next meeting is held, let's assume that we have a compliance that's suboptimal or subpar. What do you think the coalition should do?
But April is not an OPEC meeting. April is a meeting of what's called a Market Monitoring Committee. Okay. The big meeting is still in June. So they will look at the things to assess how far things are gone and whether they should cut more or not. But at the end of the day, the Saudis, you have to remember, the Saudis used to produce around 9 million barrels per day in 2015. Now it's still around 10. So if they have to cut back, they will cut back to defend the price. But they cannot cut back too hard because they don't want to push the prices too high to irritate Donald Trump. So people, if they keep it within the $65 range, he's not going to complain too much. But if it goes above 70, 75, then he will complain. So until he's in office, I think they have to walk eggshells around him.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about the entire Iran factor. I mean, do you think that the market perhaps overestimated Trump's ability to actually cause the exports from Iran to dwindle down to zero? I mean, I'm not talking about the waivers, naturally, that have as well been a reason why exports have not dwindled down to zero, but still the fact that, Saudi pumped out record oil, at least in November, Russia, America, they all pumped out huge amounts of oil to sort of preempt that supply shortage that may come by because of the Iran sanctions. So do you think we sort of overestimated his ability?
Let me be clear. If the US wants Iran's export to go to zero, it will go to zero.
It will, okay.
It will go to zero.
All right.
All the protestations from India, China, that we disagree, we want to buy, this is all talk. It comes to action. No Indian company will touch Iranian oil under the US sun.
A large part of our oil does depend on Iran.
No. If you don't have it, you just buy it from the Saudis. There is plenty of oil in the market. India would like to diversify, have many sources, special relationship with Iran. But when the US Treasury says no, it is no. It is not up to a government to say, I'm going to fight it, because any company which is involved would be cut off from the US dollar, cut off from the bonds. All of the IOC bonds will become declining significantly if it is stopped. It's become target of the US Treasury sanctions. So nobody will fight the US Treasury. Fight the US soldiers, but don't fight the US Treasury.
I heard that line. It was a very interesting one. So let's say if the waivers, what do you think, America's going to do? Are they still going to extend the waivers to China and to India as they did in November?
My view is that yes, because Donald Trump also knows that if he takes all this oil out, then the prices will go up. He doesn't want the prices to go up. His key was to cut Iran from income. And at the moment, any money that Iran pays to India, any oil Iran sells to India, Iran gets no money. The money becomes rupees sitting in a bank. Iran's last money from the last sanction was paid by SR and Ayara in August of 2018, 3 years after the sanctions. So this money, the Iranians were not seeing any money. So he succeeded in cutting Iran off from the oil market. So why should I have any sanctions against Iran anyway? Because Iran, as a high oil producer, important oil producer, has political influence. A smaller oil producer has less political influence. But in terms of what money goes to Iran, still is zero.
Venezuela, that's the other geography that under Mr. Maduro has been quite rattled. All sorts of tensions at this point of time. Do you think that the market has still not been able to absorb the fact that Venezuela's output may dwindle down, or in fact has almost dwindled down close to zero, and we haven't seen the oil markets react in as much of to the extent that we did see it earlier?
Yes, I think you're right. The impact of it hasn't been felt yet. A lot of it is still underwater. And but people are receiving it but cannot pay now.
Okay.
And 500,000 barrels per day was imported to the US. All the ships are in the US ports, but they can't pay Venezuela. So the US say, pay to the special account which goes to the opposition leader, but we can't pay him. And the US is now coming after everybody, including in India, saying that you cannot buy anymore. So here the impact is on Reliance and SR. And the Venezuelan team was at Petrotech strong, trying to find a buyer. But when the US says no, it's no. I don't think anybody will buy from them.
So do you think that we could be seeing a belated, perhaps, impact of this?
Yes. I think if this continues for more than a month or two, then you see a significant impact. Then you would have a upward pressure on price. But the Saudis have promised the US to replace it, and they can.
What if there's a regime change? I mean, it looks quite likely. We already did have those mass protests last week. It looks more or less likely. The new leadership is trying to, and he has been able to garner a lot of support from Europe, from America.
Yes. If there is a regime change, the Venezuelan production can begin to go up, probably to around 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day. But Mr. Chavez and Mr. Maduro have ruined the industry. really have ruined it in such a way that it takes 10 years to bring it back to the way it used to be. So immediately go up to 1.5 to 2, but then very slow progress towards the higher numbers.
Okay, all right. So it will very gradually come back to its optimum utilization levels. I want to talk to you now. I mean, we did discuss quite in depth on the supply side. Now I want to talk to you about the demand side. You made a very interesting point in the presentation that between now and 2030, 2040, we may be seeing the last era of growth in oil demand. It's a serious concern. I mean, right now we're seeing at about 0.7% per annum. So do you think that in the next few years we could actually perhaps be seeing, if not negative, but maybe flat demand growth?
I think we'll see a growth still for many, many years to come, but the growth which is not for gasoline and diesel, but for jet fuel and naphtha, petrochemical-based fuels, and for aviation. There is highly unlikely that you see demand growth. No, I have to be clear. In Asia, the demand growth continues until 2040, before it flattens, but the money is not there. When the global oil demand peaks in 2030, 32, then the refining margins begin to fall. So no point in producing oil and selling it, refined products, if you don't make any money.
Okay, all right. So what is the trend right now you're witnessing? I mean, you know, with the entire change of political stances across the world, I recently read a report about how Asia crude soar, which is usually something that's priced below Brent, has actually gone higher because of, you know, because of the low sulfur content and how Venezuela has actually stopped production. So what's the broad trend that we are seeing in various grades of oil? And how do you see it essentially change the power equation?
Well, you know, you're right that what's happened is that big countries, big heavy oil producers such as Venezuela, also Iran, and to some extent Mexico, they go out of the market, then the heavy grades become more expensive. And the differential between the Dubai crude, which is supposed to be several dollars below the price of Brent, Dubai crude is higher than Brent. And last month, for the first time, the price of fuel oil went above the price of gasoline. So this is because of these events which are pressure in the market. But there is there's an order in this business. This order will come back. What is now impacting this market is the IMO coming in there. IMO will push the heavy grade prices down and will push the light grade prices up. This is coming very soon, January 2020, but the impact of it from September, October will be very visible. So some of these things which are forced by Venezuela, Iran crisis will be resolved by IMO, not by human hand.
Okay, so it's just a temporary blip that we are seeing this,
Yes.
and IMO is going to. So, you know, actually we don't talk much about IMO, but I just want to understand the implications. Shipping industry, yes, but from a refining point of view, I mean, even Indian refiners are going to be impacted by IMO 2020. So if you could enumerate the impact of that on both, first up the refiners, of course, and the shipping industry.
See, if you produce no fuel oil, such as the Jamnagar refinery, you're okay, it doesn't matter, irrelevant.
Okay.
Because you don't have a problem to become like a noose around your neck, pull you down, high sulfur fuel oil.
So RIL's Jamnagar refinery would be...
They are fine. You know,
Okay.
they are, in this environment, the worst thing that you want is high sulfur fuel oil.
Okay.
But the other ones, for example, the IOC refineries, they are made a significant progress in actually making 1 million tons of 0.5%, which is the compliant fuel. 0.5% can become $30, $40 more expensive per barrel than the high sulfur fuel oil. So they're taking something low sulfur and converting it to high sulfur without making a huge investment. And so I think the Indian companies are ready. They're ready in this market, and they will benefit. And if you have requirement for shipping in India, but even if you don't have it, you go in the market with 0.5%, everybody will queue outside your door and try to get it. Because the market will come to balance. The problem is that the people should have built scrubbers earlier on to be able to use high sulfur fuel oil, make it low sulfur fuel oil. Because they are late, this imbalance in the market 2.5 years would be a very big deal, which means that the 0.5% can be the price of diesel in the market. So instead of being the price of fuel oil, become price of diesel, while the price of high sulfur fuel oil collapses. So it does, those who make investment in scrubbers can get their money back in 6 months, 9 months.
Oh, in 6 months, okay.
So, but the question is that they're all late, so they haven't made it. So I think that the private sector companies here are all okay. Public sector companies are all ready.
Okay, so it's going to be disruptive, but Indian companies, at least at this point of time, seem to be okay.
Indian companies, in a way, we have to realize that, while 10 years ago India's oil industry was backward industry, Indian refiners, they're going to go to Euro 6 ahead of the Europeans. So they can argue that burning Euro 6 it gives you less carbon emissions than natural gas. So they are all ready. And Indians, as far as the specification is concerned, are number one in the world.
Okay, that's good to know. So keeping it with the India story and India's role, or rather India's part in the entire energy complex, we do have elections coming up. What do you think one must watch out for when it comes to India's role to play in the energy complex, and that at such a crucial time? Like you mentioned, you did point out to the West gas refinery that's coming up in India. How would you look at the entire dynamics of the Indian oil market?
I think the Indian oil market, the political impact of it is that while we go to the election, the price of gas is low, the price of electricity is low, and the price of oil is not so high because of the international consideration. So no negative impact for the government. So I think our government can claim lots of victories, and especially as it deregulated the oil market pretty much, but deregulated at a time of low oil prices, so easier to deregulate. Right after the election, the challenge is that to let the gas prices go up so that India can become a bigger importer. With the current gas prices, it's very hard to import. The pollution in Delhi is shocking, worse than it is in Beijing. But India needs to import a lot of natural gas. There's no choice. But that requires the electricity prices to go up. And the politically is not very acceptable. So you do these things after the election, not before the election.
Okay, and you spoke about the conversation with Mr. Pradhan as well. At $80, he was naturally very circumspect about oil demand, but still it stayed steady. So do you think that's the state we are in, that we've more or less become completely dependent, or demand for oil is inelastic?
I think demand for oil is that $80 oil is no longer too high for India. And in practice, we've seen it. Maybe after a year, it makes an impact. But basically, Indian economy has grown, the ability to pay has gone up. Hasn't gone up for natural gas and the electricity sector yet, but on the oil side it has. So good politics, but in practice, Indian companies, Indian consumer can pay.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about the entire clean energy conundrum. You yourself have an electric vehicle, like you mentioned, so it's personal experience that you're talking about. But how much of a threat is that, and how soon is this threat going to become bigger for the energy complex to deal with?
I think the people who say by 2025 electric cars are coming, this is all nonsense. Not going to happen. But you look at the numbers are pretty simple. That you have 1 billion cars on the road, combustion engine, and then you have a few million electric cars. So you give it a 50% growth rate. See how many years it takes to have an impact. But what is really impacting the market? Number one is efficiency. Number two is plug-in hybrid. Number three is electric. So they will make an impact, but 10, 15 years it'll take.
Okay, all right. So just as I'm going to wind up this discussion, I'm going to pose a question to you that everybody, and I think all viewers would want to know, is what is Dr. Fesharaki's opinion on where oil markets could range in 2019? A level that Trump would be happy with, a level that Saudis as well would be happy with, and of course we Indian consumers as well would be happy with. So what do you think is going to be a range that the Brent prices could trade at for 2019?
I think first half of the year is 60, 65. Second half of the year between 65, 70, with some odd times, depending on what happens in Venezuela, it may jump to 75. But basically the latter half of this year, 65 to 70, without geopolitics, is what supply-demand tells us.
And without Trump tweets.
Without Trump tweets, yes.
Okay, great, Dr. Fesharaki. It was an absolute pleasure, sir.
Thank you very much.